You are about to embark on a virtual tour of Gettysburg National Military Park. But before we explore the exhibits, let's take a look at the history of this battle. The town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is in the southern part of the state and close to the borders of Maryland and West Virginia. Confederate General Robert E. Lee moved into Gettysburg for several reasons. First, after several key victories at battles like Chancellorsville, he wanted to draw out and try to destroy the Union Army once and for all. Doing this would allow his army to attack Washington, D.C. from the north, which was only lightly defended. As you can see from the map, the only thing between the Army of Virginia and our nation's capital was the Army of the Potomac. Another reason for Lee to move his troops into the area was that Gettysburg was at a crossroads for several thoroughfares and railroads, and it would allow him to gain vital supplies and routes if he captured the town. While the Confederate Army always had solid leadership and tactics, it was usually lacking in supplies and men, and Lee was willing to capture a town for something as simple as shoes for his army, which was something that Gettysburg had plenty of. 3 days of bloody battle waged throughout the hills and fields of the town. Thousands were killed and tens of thousands were wounded. In the end, it was the Union who was faster in getting to the high ground. The elevated positions made for a great place to view enemy movements, direct artillery fire, and defend their positions. Even though the Confederates had partially encircled the Union, they simply couldn't break through their lines while fighting in open spaces and up steep hills. This battle was a good example of the old military adage that he who controls the high ground controls the battle. Several high-ranking generals on both sides were killed or wounded that day, but in the end, Lee had no choice but to retreat, or else his army would have been completely destroyed. This was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. 165,620 men met on the field of battle over those hot 3 days in July of 1863, and nearly 8,000 would never leave the place alive. It wasn't just that the Confederates lost more men, it was that they couldn't afford to do so. With the population of the South being drastically less than it was in the North, every man lost meant they were one step away from defeat. Today, Gettysburg is a national military park, a national military cemetery, and has hundreds of monuments dedicated to individuals and unions across more than 600 acres of land. According to the National Park Service, about 3 million people a year visit the battlefield. Every field trip starts with a place to get some information and perhaps some guidance. Gettysburg is no different. The Visitor Center looks like it is quite old, but is actually very new. This is the second Visitor Center at Gettysburg, and this one was built to meet the needs of newer technology to accommodate visitors, as well as a more convenient location. The center has a museum with artifacts and reproductions, a one-of-a-kind cyclorama, which is a 360-degree painting with artifacts, lighting effects, a voiceover narration, and sound effects of the battle. It also has restrooms, a snack bar, maps, and other information that visitors might need while exploring Gettysburg. Here we can see two reproductions of Civil War soldiers. On the left is a rebel trooper with his bedroll and gray uniform. On the right, the boy in blue is a Union soldier with his haversack and forage cap. Here we see several historic flags. Note the palm tree to the upper right corner of your screen. This is the emblem of South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. Take a look at some of these interesting artifacts from the museum. We have a small cannon, a drum that was used by a New York outfit, shells that were dug up near Gettysburg, and a cannonball reportedly fired at Fort Sumter during the first battle of the war. The Gettysburg Address is perhaps the most famous oration in American history. It has been said, ironically enough, that Lincoln himself didn't initially think the speech was very good. The brief and merely polite applause at the end of this speech may have influenced his feelings on this. The site of the speech is now part of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. The Gettysburg Cemetery is part of the National Military Cemetery System. There are several such cemeteries across the nation, including Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and of course Arlington National Cemetery outside of Washington, D.C. Today, through modern technologies such as dog tags and DNA, the bodies of our fallen service members can be identified and shipped home for proper burial with relative ease. During the Civil War, however, it was common for soldiers who were killed in action to be buried in large, common graves. Most families never got official word from the War Department that their loved ones had been killed. They would only find out if a fellow soldier happened to write a letter to the family of the dead, or when after the war, the soldiers simply never came home. Every state that had units in this great battle have erected monuments to the men who served and died over those 3 days in July. They range from simple stone markers to large obelisks that tower over the Pennsylvania landscape. This is the Soldiers' Memorial. It marks the spot where in November of 1863 Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, dedicating that part of the battlefield as a national cemetery. Here are a few photos from the New York Monument. Note in the second photo the different symbols. These were used to differentiate between different regiments and even different branches of the military. Note in the fourth photo the word Excelsior, which is the New York State motto and Latin for even higher. Here we have photos of two unit monuments. The first is for the 75th Pennsylvania Volunteers, and the second is for the 20th Brigade Artillery Battery of the 5th New York Regiment. Here are some more unit monuments. Note how some are reminiscent of large tombstones, while others display figures of soldiers in battle. These next monuments represent what are perhaps the most famous units from the Battle of Gettysburg, the 20th Maine and the Irish Brigade. The 20th Maine was led by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a college professor in his civilian life, and who, using some little-known battlefield tactics, repulsed wave after wave of Confederate attack, even when his men were out of ammunition. For his defense of the hills of Little Round Top and Big Round Top, Chamberlain was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Irish Brigade was made up of several regiments of Irish Americans from New York. In fact, many of these men were new immigrants to this country. The most famous of these units was the 69th Infantry Regiment that came to be known as the Fighting 69th. This unit served until the very end of the war and went on to fight in both World Wars and continues service today in Iraq and Afghanistan. The unit's motto, gentle when stroked, fierce when provoked, is reference to the Irish wolfhound that is the unit's mascot. You can see in these photos that the monuments vary greatly, but the most common marker at Gettysburg is doubtlessly the cannon. These artillery pieces range from traditional smoothbore field pieces to state-of-the-art rifled guns that could deliver high explosives accurately over long distances. The largest state monument by area, and the only one visitors can climb to the top of, is the Pennsylvania Monument. The Keystone State lost a higher percentage of men during this battle than any other state, and considering that the troops were defending their homeland from invasion, it is no surprise. The top of this monument provides a 360-degree view of the area. That'd make for some great photos. New Jersey's monument might not be as large or ornate as New York or Pennsylvania's, but it is a solemn and fitting tribute to those from the Garden State who fought and died to preserve the Union. It is reminiscent of a medieval castle tower and features the different regiments that fought at Gettysburg. Additionally, the three plows surrounded by branches represent New Jersey's farming heritage. There are also a number of monuments dedicated to the individual leaders of the battle. Generals Meade and Lee, who were the leaders of their respective armies, have their own equine bronze statues. General Lee's memorial is actually part of the Virginia Monument, which is fitting since when Lincoln personally asked him to lead federal troops against the South, he declined by saying, "My heart belongs to Virginia." Topography, or the elevation and depression of an area, can help determine the outcome of a battle. Let's look at some photos that show the diverse landscape of Gettysburg. Gettysburg is a battle known for its hills. Cemetery Hill, Seminary Hill, and the large hills of Big and Little Round Top are good observation points for tourists today, as well as troops in 1863. These elevated positions are difficult for attackers to capture and make great places for a commander to observe a battle or to place artillery pieces to rain down on the infantry below. These rocky outcroppings are known as the Devil's Den. This was an area that saw fierce close-quarters fighting in 1863. Today, children play where men once gave their last full measure of devotion to their country. Gettysburg also has some open areas that are of importance as well. The main field of battle, the site of Pickett's charge, and known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, is an area where many hundreds died on a final, desperate, and ultimately futile charge on the third day. That charge took place over 1.5 miles of fields where the troops had to get over fences while being subjected to devastating artillery fire. Men fell by the scores, yet they kept on charging. A Confederate general by the name of Lewis Armistead was shot 3 times as he got to the wall that marked the Union lines. When a Union captain was tending to him, he learned that his old friend Winfield Scott Hancock was commanding the area he was attacking and had also been wounded. Hancock survived the war, but Armistead died of his wounds several days later. Gettysburg is one of the most visited battlefields in the world and has an excellent educational and cultural program to bring history alive. Part of this program is historical reenactments. Living historians on both sides often use the park to set up camp, run drills, and have a skirmish or two, so that visitors might get just a taste of how it was to live, serve, and die in 1863. These reenactors are volunteers who are required to use only period-accurate uniforms and equipment. Even reenactors who wear eyeglasses must use the frames and materials that were available during the Civil War. They cook over campfires, shave with straight razors, and generally live as soldiers would have in the 1860s while they're in character. These men and women travel across the country in different units, typically divided by state, and become experts in the use and care of their equipment. Interested in visiting the park? It is about a 3.5-hour drive from the Jersey Shore area. There are plenty of hotels and inns around the town and surrounding areas, and rates are competitive. The park is open year-round, so be sure to dress accordingly to the weather. That includes bringing plenty of water during the warmer months, and since there is a great deal of walking, comfortable footwear is a must. Finally, if you can stay overnight, you definitely should do it in order to get 2 good days in of sightseeing. Remember, the actual battle took place over 3 whole days. Spending only 3 hours in the park will cause you to miss quite a bit.